Sunday in Little Wexham moved to its own rhythm, slow and civilized. At the vicarage, nestled modestly among hollyhocks and trimmed laurels, the Reverend Durrant and his wife prepared for their customary afternoon tea. Mrs. Durrant, who valued linen and schedule in equal measure, laid out her starched cloth and bone china with the air of one conducting an Anglican liturgy. The invitation list, as always, was precise. Mrs. Calthorpe, the butcher's wife with a flair for genealogies, Mr. Harold Linton, who taught Latin at the grammar school, and the Holloways, who had returned from Torquay, with unspoken tension between them and a mild suntan. There was no room or expectation for surprise. The vicar polished his spectacles and read over his brief Sunday homily, while his wife ensured the scones had risen. It was a gathering like any other in their small world, genteel, measured, steeped in ritual. And yet, even as the kettle began its soft whistle and the marmalade was placed precisely at the table center, a slight disturbance was already approaching, one that would neither be announced nor remembered in the church register. A name was missing, though none yet knew it, and someone else intended to fill the place. At precisely 10 minutes past 4, when the guests had taken their seats and the tea had been poured with the satisfying grace of porcelain against porcelain, a man of lean build and indeterminate age stepped through the open garden gate. He was dressed in a pale gray suit, well tailored but faintly worn at the cuffs, and held a soft felt hat against his chest as he approached. His shoes, Miss Calthorpe would later note, bore no trace of country dust. His manner was self-assured but unassuming, and he bowed ever so slightly before speaking. "So sorry," he said, in a voice that held a hint of London. "I believe I was invited by Mr. Durrant, George Durrant, the vicar." The vicar, momentarily flustered, offered a courteous smile, his memory visibly flitting through mental guest lists, like hymns in a half-forgotten psalter. Mrs. Durrant, with instinctive grace, made space beside the hydrangeas and introduced him to the group as a late arrival, no doubt confused by our village lanes. The gentleman offered no surname, nor did he seem eager to provide one. Yet he slipped into the gathering, with the comfort of someone who had long observed such afternoons, and knew precisely how to go unnoticed in plain sight. He spoke easily, though never at length. He knew the correct intervals at which to chuckle, the polite astonishment required when hearing of Mrs. Calthorpe's second cousin, who had once dined with the Earl of Westbury. But his questions when they came bore a strangely personal edge. "Is the Bleakridge family still in the area?" he asked quite offhandedly, while stirring his tea with the silver spoon. "Or was the estate sold in the end?" And to Mr. Linton quite suddenly, "You've been here how long? 20 years. You must know who used to live in the red-bricked house near the mill." There was something peculiarly pointed about the way he phrased his queries, though never impolite. It was as if he were collecting details rather than engaging in gossip, a cataloguer of lives, not a mere listener. Mrs. Durrant thought his cologne oddly floral, more suited to a drawing-room lady than a middle-aged man. She could not place it until later, when she remembered the scent of heliotrope that lingered faintly whenever he leaned forward. He declined a second scone, folded his napkin with deliberate care, and never touched the marmalade. When he rose to leave, no one noticed the slight pressure he left behind, like a question half-asked. By 5:30 the party began its gentle dissolution. Mrs. Calthorpe excused herself with exaggerated regret, while the Holloways lingered just long enough to be proper. The vicar returned to his study, murmuring something about a misplaced hymnal. and Mrs. Darrant gathered cups with the efficiency of a woman who found purpose in porcelain. It was not until the tray had been cleared and the last crumbs of shortbread swept away that someone asked, "Where did the gentleman go?" There was a pause, uncertain at first, then strangely collective. No one recalled seeing him leave, not through the gate, nor by the rose archway. He had simply vanished. The chair he had occupied bore no impression, and his teacup remained precisely where it had been set, empty but clean. He must have slipped off during the hymn discussion, Mr. Linton suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Mrs. Darrant checked the guest list once more, confirmed what she already knew, and found her finger hovering over a space between names. Miss Calthorpe, who prided herself on a memory as precise as her embroidery stitches, was troubled. "No one introduced him properly," she murmured, "and I don't believe he ever said his name." Miss Marple, staying for the week at her cousin Helen's cottage just beyond the churchyard, was not present at the vicarage that afternoon. Yet the tale reached her by supper, delivered with relish and a touch of suspicion by Helen, who had received the news from Mrs. Calthorpe via the grocer. A man no one remembers inviting, and no one saw leave. Helen said with a slight shiver, though her tone was not entirely displeased. "Sounds like something out of a magazine serial." Miss Marple, who had set down her knitting in favor of a boiled egg, listened with interest. The mention of the Bleakridge name piqued her memory. A family once prominent, then quietly dissolved in the mist of social discretion and whispered scandal. She asked about the gentleman's appearance, manner, voice, and then, almost absently, whether anyone noticed a particular scent. "Why, yes," said Helen, frowning slightly. Mrs. Darrant thought it was heliotrope. Miss Marple's brows rose a fraction. It was not a common fragrance, not for a gentleman. She recalled its old-fashioned sweetness from a distant cousin who had once hidden love letters in lavender sachets. "I dare say," she murmured. "He didn't come just for the tea." Evening settled over Little Wexham like a sigh, and with it came the hush that only a Sunday can bring. The roads emptied, the birds softened, and the bells stilled. But in the garden behind the vicarage, a faint rustle disturbed the hedge near the south wall. It was not noticed until the next morning, when young Alec, sent to retrieve a dropped ball, let out a short yelp. There, partially hidden beneath the overgrown boxwood, lay a walking stick, snapped clean in two. The vicar, summoned with haste, examined it with mild bewilderment. It was finely carved, with a silver band at the neck and a worn leather grip. Neither he nor Mrs. Darrant recognized it. The break was clean, not splintered, as though the cane had been deliberately broken rather than crushed underfoot. Miss Marple was called to inspect it. She held it delicately, noting the softness of the leather, the faded initials near the hilt. Too faint to read, but once there, undoubtedly. "It's a gentleman's cane," she said softly, "though I wonder whether it was ever meant for walking." And as her gaze turned to the hedge beyond, a faint unease stirred in the pit of her stomach. Not fear, but something colder. A certainty. The arrival of Mr. Julian Fry in Little Wexham was not announced with fanfare, nor marked with much curiosity, at least not initially. He was a quiet sort of man, with an impeccable black overcoat, and a leather case that bore the scuffs of urban purpose. His expression suggested he had long ago given up expecting people to like solicitors on sight. It was only when he presented his credentials to the vicar and requested a brief use of the parish office that the rumor wheel began to turn. He explained, softly, and with the dry courtesy of his profession, that he had been sent by a firm in Lincoln's Inn to trace the living heir to the Bleakridge estate, a name that had not passed most lips in the village for 2 decades. Lady Eleanor Bleakridge, long presumed childless, had died nearly a year earlier. Her will had been contested and re-evaluated, and now it seemed that a codicil had emerged, naming a direct descendant, presumed lost or illegitimate. Mr. Fry made no accusations, only inquiries. He would be in the village for a few days, he said, long enough to speak with those who might remember the family's more discreet branches. He took a room at the Holloways, then set about listening rather than asking. No sooner had the solicitor taken up residence than Mrs. Calthorpe re-emerged as a figure of considerable importance. It was she who had once claimed at a church fete in '37 that her second cousin's husband had worked as steward to the Bleakridge estate. Now, with barely concealed relish, she introduced her cousin Vera as a likely candidate for Lady Eleanor's elusive heir. Vera Calthorpe was a woman of uncertain age and very certain opinions. She lived modestly in a slate-roofed cottage at the edge of the village, and had always moved with a kind of defensive pride, as if guarding a past no one had challenged. The news of a potential inheritance did not delight her. Rather, it seemed to irritate something dormant. She began to make uncharacteristic visits, dropping in on the vicar's wife, requesting tea with the Holloways, even nodding to Miss Marple as they passed near the baker's. Others soon began submitting their own tenuous connections. Old family trees were consulted, and forgotten photographs, brought down from attic chests, all under the surface, of course. Little Wexham prided itself on its dignity, but in drawing rooms, scented faintly with lavender polish, something sharper was beginning to stir, something like rivalry, and something close to fear. It began innocently enough. Mrs. Durrant noticed an embroidered handkerchief missing from the drawer in the hall. Tilly, the maid, swore she had pressed it just the day before. Then, a small silver butter knife vanished, one that had belonged to the vicar's mother, and had never left the sideboard. Finally, a small blue vial, labeled in elegant copper plate, laudanum, as directed, was found to be missing from the cupboard above the scullery sink. Each incident was minor. Taken separately, they could be chalked up to forgetfulness or the mischief of passing hands. Yet Mrs. Durrant, whose memory remained crisp and unyielding, began to grow pale with unease. The vicar, ever the peacemaker, suggested that the house was simply in a stir due to the solicitor's presence. But Miss Marple, when told of the missing items over supper, lifted her brows very slightly. She asked what sort of laudanum the Durrants kept, and whether it had been prescribed. "A bottle from the apothecary at Newton Gate," said Helen vaguely. "But they've not used it in months." Miss Marple nodded once, her knitting slowing. "Things rarely go missing in houses where nothing is being hidden," she said softly, "though not always by the same hand that hides them. Sunday brought with it a peculiar shift. The pews at St. Jude's were unusually full, and not merely with the devout. Mrs. Holloway, who had long excused herself on grounds of lumbago, appeared early and lingered afterwards to chat about the Bleakridge window above the altar. Young Alec, known more for cricket than catechism, accompanied his aunt and stood unusually still during the homily. Miss Marple, seated quietly beside her cousin, observed the congregation with the detached interest of one who had seen many such assemblies. It was not the presence of faces, but the tension in them, that caught her eye. The way Vera Calthorpe seemed to watch Mr. Frey's every move, or the strained civility with which the Durrants greeted Mrs. Linton, whose mother had once worked as a housemaid at Bleakridge. After the service, the village green buzzed with light remarks and heavier silences. "Such a nice young man," said Mrs. Durrant, referring to Mr. Frey. "So polite." But there was an undercurrent to her words, and her glances towards her tea tray had grown unusually vigilant. Miss Marple remarked as they walked back to Helen's cottage that when a village begins to tidy its lineage, it rarely stops at dusting photographs. By midweek, the name of Bleakridge had worked its way back into the village's bloodstream. Once synonymous with faded grandeur and closed shutters, it was now murmured over market stalls, behind lace curtains, and beneath the eaves of the post office queue. The old stories resurfaced: Lady Eleanor's withdrawn manner, her abrupt departure from the parish board, the companion who lived with her for years, never spoken of, then suddenly vanished. There was talk of a summer visit from a London niece whose existence no one had ever formally confirmed. The idea of an illegitimate child, a rumor once whispered and swiftly buried, was now aired with cautious speculation. Some insisted they had always known. Others professed no memory of the companion at all. But Miss Marple noted which villagers were eager to remember and which were careful to forget. It was not just curiosity. It was proximity. The inheritance had come close enough to breathe upon them, and with it, the chance, however remote, that one of their own might ascend. Mr. Frey meanwhile made his visits quietly, his notes discreet. He was observed speaking briefly to the vicar, and longer still to Vera, but his face remained inscrutable, save for one quiet frown on Thursday afternoon. The following morning brought with it a cold hush. Mr. Frey was found slumped in the garden behind the vicarage, not far from the rose border, his teacup tipped gently into the grass. A half-finished scone lay beside it, untouched. Dr. Penworthy, summoned swiftly and with trembling urgency by Mrs. Durrant, could not state a cause immediately, but his tone was grave. A seizure, perhaps, or poison, he added softly, not looking up. What startled most was the telegram in Mr. Frey's coat pocket, sealed, unopened, and addressed to himself. Its contents, when later read by the authorities, suggested the confirmation of an heir, a name, a destination. The village recoiled with restrained horror. A man had died, not violently, but with the unnatural quiet of a candle snuffed by unseen breath. The constable came. Questions were asked. The solicitor's belongings were sealed, but not before Miss Marple, with her usual courtesy, inquired after the placement of the tea things. "Just so," she murmured, gazing at the teacup, alone in its pattern. And in her mind, something shifted. The smell of heliotrope, the snapped cane, the visitor with no name. She did not yet know the answer, but she knew the question had changed. Dr. Penworthy, whose professional manner leaned more toward cautious phrasing than outright alarm, nonetheless delivered his pronouncement with a stern finality. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, had found its way into Mr. Frey's system, a quantity sufficient not merely to upset digestion, but to still a heart entirely. The conclusion reluctantly offered was not illness, but murder. The implication sent a tremor through the parish. Poisoning, in Little Wexham, among teacups and parsnip sandwiches. The vicar was mortified. Mrs. Durrant, ever the picture of gentle composure, turned quite pale, and had to be helped to a chair. Attention turned inevitably to the teapot, unremarkable in itself, a generous brown pot with a faded gilt band. Dr. Penworthy confirmed that the remaining tea bore traces of the poison, and that it had been steeped thoroughly. Yet no bitterness had been noted. Whoever had administered the dose had done so with either precise skill or cunning luck. Miss Marple, when asked, merely inclined her head and observed that such matters rarely relied on chance. Poison, she reminded the vicar gently, was a private act, one not committed in rage or haste, but in stillness and forethought. It is, she said, the method of the quiet, and often the kind. And someone had been very quiet indeed. The afternoon tea in question had been small but proper, 6 guests in all, seated under the clematis trellis, served by Mrs. Durrant with the same calm ritual she had practiced for 20 years. Tea was poured from the common pot, cream and sugar passed hand to hand, and conversation meandered from garden pests to the unexpected warmth of the season. All ordinary, all polite. Only one guest, it transpired, had requested a second cup. Mr. Frey, ever understated, had quietly thanked his hostess and accepted a refill some 20 minutes after the first round. The others had demurred, Mrs. Calthorpe citing her digestion, the Holloways engaged in hushed marital disagreement, and Miss Linton preoccupied with a wasp near the jam. It was this simple, seemingly gracious act, the extra cup, that sealed his fate. The same teapot had served them all. But if the fatal dose had been placed in the vessel itself, why did no one else show symptoms? Miss Marple pondered this as she sat by the fire that evening. The answer, she suspected, lay not in the teapot, but in something smaller, more intimate. A spoon, perhaps. A cup. The quiet detail only noticed by the hand that arranged it. And one person, she thought, had been watching the table more than most. The village, being a place where silence often carried more meaning than speech, did not speak openly of accusation. But eyes lingered longer on Vera Calthorpe than was usual. Her name, whispered behind drawn curtains, now bore a weight previously reserved for scandal. She had, as several recalled with troubling clarity, exchanged sharp words with Mr. Frey just 2 days prior. A matter of documents, perhaps. Or perhaps an implication that she was not, as she had long claimed, a legitimate descendant of the Bleakridge line. Whatever the truth, Vera had left the conversation with her lips pressed thin and her hands trembling faintly. Now she held herself apart. When she came to the greengrocer, she selected her items in silence. At church, she sat in the last pew. Her composure was brittle and her answers clipped. The inference was subtle but firm. She had motive. Disinheritance is a powerful thing, especially when one has lived with the shadow of expectation. And Mr. Fry, with his sealed papers and unwelcome authority, may well have threatened it. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. Motive, yes. But the manner? Poison was not Vera's way. Her hands trembled too easily, and poison required steadiness, of heart and hand alike. It was not until Tilly, the vicarage maid, was gently questioned by Miss Marple herself, that a curious recollection emerged. The girl was not inclined to gossip, but neither was she immune to fear. Her hands twisted the hem of her apron as she spoke. She remembered, she said, a strange moment just before tea had been served. Mrs. Durrant had stepped away to tend to a kettle, and the tray, already prepared, had been left on the sideboard. Tilly had returned to fetch it, and had paused upon seeing a guest nearby. Lydia, the Holloways' visiting niece, in her pale gloves and tasteful dress, was adjusting the placement of the sugar tongs. Or so it had seemed. Tilly had not thought it odd at the time. Lydia had smiled, made some small remark about symmetry, and stepped away. But now, in light of the tragedy, the gesture replayed itself with new sharpness. The gloved hand, the delicate movement, the unnecessary adjustment. Miss Marple listened, her expression unreadable. Then she asked whether Lydia had handled the sugar bowl or simply touched the tray. Tilly hesitated. "The sugar spoon, I think," she whispered. She turned it round, just slightly. And with that, Miss Marple's mind turned swiftly toward a possibility others had not yet imagined. In a corner of the church vestry, among ledgers browned with age and scented faintly of mildew, Miss Marple sought answers not in gossip, but in records. She believed in the quiet authority of ink and vellum, and she knew that truths buried in paper often outlived those whispered in drawing rooms. She looked first to the register of baptisms, specifically the years surrounding the latter half of Lady Eleanor Bleakridge's public life. There were familiar names, family servants, and cousins by marriage. But then came something unexpected. A child, born without a father's name, listed as female, and baptized under initials only, E.B. The date aligned too neatly with Lady Eleanor's absence from village life, a season when she had purportedly taken ill and traveled abroad. The entry had no annotations, no sponsors, and bore the unmistakable carelessness of a hurried cleric. Miss Marple sat in the stillness, her finger resting on the fading page. A child born of discretion, hidden, perhaps, sent away. Yet somehow, the thread had returned. Could it be that the heir Mr. Fry had uncovered was not Vera, nor any known name, but someone who had passed through the village not as a claimant, but as a companion? The silence of the archive answered only in dust, but it was a dust that settled with purpose. On a second visit to the archives, prompted by a persistent unease, Miss Marple examined a marriage register, not for what it contained, but for what it concealed. There, toward the back, beneath a column of carefully inscribed names, she found an entry faintly marred, scratched, as though by a knife's hesitant edge. The ink beneath had faded, but not beyond recall. A name had once been entered, initials, then a surname. It had been scraped away and overwritten with a more respectable designation. The replacement, written in a tidier hand, was one known well to the village, Mrs. Durrant. It made sense now. The quiet composure, the withdrawn nature, the soft tremor when Lady Eleanor's name had been uttered over tea. She had not merely served as companion. She had been something far more delicate, something far more dangerous to the inheritance in question. Miss Marple closed the register gently. The conclusion came not as surprise, but confirmation. Mrs. Durrant was the child born of Lady Eleanor's discretion. Her identity had been carefully reconstructed, protected under layers of modesty and church service, and someone had discovered it. Mr. Fry had known, or had come too close, which meant the question was no longer who had a motive, but who knew that they didn't belong. It was often Miss Marple's method to begin with something quite unrelated. Over a gentle cup of tea poured with courtesy rather than purpose, she asked old Thomas, not directly about Lady Eleanor, but about the state of the Bleakridge roses that year. Thomas, long retired and bearing a quiet pride in the work of his youth, was eager to oblige. Soon memory took the reins. He spoke slowly, the way older men do when the past surprises them by how near it still feels. "There used to be a young lady," he said, "used to visit the back garden. Never came through the front, wore lavender, always lavender, a scarf or gloves, or once even a whole dress." Miss Marple let the silence stretch, encouraging him with nothing more than a soft nod. "She weren't a servant," Thomas added, almost as an afterthought. "Too polite, and Lady Eleanor never mentioned her. But she came regular for a while, would sit beneath the holly tree, always the same bench. Lavender, The scent had returned again. A young woman, out of place but not uninvited. The detail was not just the color, but the habit of it. The consistency, as if it were a uniform not of occupation but of identity. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And then?" she asked gently. "She stopped coming, just like that?" It was enough, and it suggested quite firmly that someone had once tried to be part of the family, quietly, and out of sight. The garden had not been kept as Thomas once maintained it, but memory clung to spaces in ways that plants did not. Miss Marple, passing the very bench the gardener had described, paused by instinct. Her eyes fell not upon the seat itself, but the cracked ceramic pot that leaned against its leg, a vessel clearly too neglected for new planting. She bent down, not hastily, but with a careful interest that drew no attention. Beneath the pot, embedded in the mossy earth, was the suggestion of something unnatural, the faint glint of rust and the curled edge of metal just visible beneath old leaves. A key. It was not ornate, but of good iron, worn smooth by time. Not dropped by accident, she thought. Placed, hidden. She said nothing at once, not even to her cousin. That evening she polished the key gently with a cloth and studied its pattern. It was the sort meant not for modern locks, but for heavy boxes, something meant to be opened only rarely, and only by one who knew what to expect. There was, of course, such a box. She had noticed it in the attic of the vicarage during a previous visit, an old chest with a lock that no one had ever tried, until now. It took Miss Marple little time to return to the attic. She asked politely, of course. Mrs. Durrant, flustered but obliging, had agreed to let her poke about for old linens. The box, once spotted but dismissed, had been pushed behind trunks and seldom disturbed furniture. The key turned without resistance, the mechanism dry but sound. Inside lay a careful collection, papers folded, photographs stacked between pages of tissue, and a ribbon-tied bundle of envelopes, the ink long faded to brown. The first document was unmistakable. A certificate of birth, female child, unnamed. Mother, Eleanor Bleakridge. Father, left blank. The date matched perfectly with the church record Miss Marple had uncovered, but now for the first time initials were added in a firm, maternal hand. E.B. The photographs showed a young girl with fine features and solemn eyes, seated beside a woman in nurse's uniform. Later images hinted at adolescence, a change of dress, and a growing resemblance to someone Miss Marple had seen, not in photograph but in church, in the flesh. The letters were unaddressed, unsent, written from mother to daughter, some tender, others apologetic, all heavy with the sorrow of necessary secrecy. Miss Marple returned each item to its place. These were not documents lost. They had been hidden, and someone once had taken great care to bury the truth inside a box, in a house where the truth now threatened to rise again. The discovery did not alter Miss Marple's outward behavior. She resumed her tea, accepted biscuits, and remarked upon the improvement in the weather. But her eyes now lingered with deliberate interest upon the small gestures of those around her. And it was Mrs. Durrant, quietly absorbed in her embroidery, who drew her attention most. The vicar's wife had long been praised for her needlework, delicate, consistent, and always just so. But it was in the corner of a linen napkin, one set aside in her sewing basket, that Miss Marple noted something peculiar, a crest, stitched with precision but not quite correctly. The family arms of Bleakridge, yes, but mirrored slightly as if remembered rather than traced. Village whispers, meanwhile, had begun to stir in earnest. The Durrant woman wasn't always the vicar's wife. Mrs. Calthorpe noted with a curious tone. Companion to Lady Eleanor, wasn't she? Years back? Companion was a word that softened scandal and muddied truth. Miss Marple folded her hands. Mrs. Darrant's modesty, her quiet restraint, her presence at the heart of events, all had once seemed ordinary. But the embroidery betrayed a memory held long and close, not of service, but of belonging. And if she was indeed the child, grown and disguised by silence, then the matter of inheritance had turned far more personal than any had suspected. Years do not dull Miss Marple's memory, nor do they distort it. The crest, imperfectly stitched, stirred something older than the present case, a scandal she had read about, or rather, heard whispered, while visiting a friend in Bath many years before. A young companion to a titled lady had disappeared quite suddenly. Dismissed, the papers claimed, though the society columns made only fleeting mention. What caught Miss Marple's attention at the time had been the timing of the dismissal, and the rumor of a London hospital visit shortly after. Lady Eleanor Bleakridge had in those days been both respected and feared. She hosted recitals for the bishop's wife, and kept the kind of companion whose silence was more valuable than her service. The scandal had faded, as such things do, but the child had never been mentioned again. Until now. Miss Marple sat back with a slow breath, the crest on Mrs. Darrant's embroidery, an echo of that old scandal, was not simply a memento. It was a slip, a lapse in vigilance from a woman who had spent decades weaving herself into respectability. But the thread had frayed, and now, with Mr. Frey's death, that concealed past had found its consequence. Someone else had known the truth, and had decided it must not come to light. It was not unusual for Miss Marple to find herself awake in the small hours. Age had taught her that the mind, like the weather, often preferred twilight. That night, a soft creak traveled down the corridor of Helen's cottage, carried on the breathless silence only deep night can provide. It was not the wind, it was purpose. From her window, Miss Marple saw the faintest movement near the vicarage attic. A figure, slim, swift, not clumsy but not quite confident either. A thief does not search, a seeker does. The attic window was found ajar the next morning, nothing taken, or so it seemed. But the box had been moved, just slightly, just enough. Miss Marple said nothing at first, but the attempt told her more than words could. Someone had grown nervous, someone who knew what lay inside that box, not guessed, knew. And that narrowed the list. Mrs. Darrant would never risk the attic in darkness. Tilly too frightened, Vera too proud. But Lydia, elegant, calculating, the niece from away, had shown a familiarity with the house that now struck Miss Marple as not just acquired, but long-standing. The question was no longer who had motive, it was who had knowledge, and something to lose if truth was spoken aloud. The storeroom at the vicarage was not often visited, save for rummaging through decorations come Christmas, or the occasional search for jam jars. It was by sheer chance, or so it might appear, that Miss Marple, helping Mrs. Darrant locate old hymnals, came upon a covered canvas propped behind a stack of hymn boards and rusted trestles. When the cloth was drawn back, the face stared solemnly from the dust. It was the portrait of a child, perhaps 6 or 7, seated against a background of soft greenery. The features were delicate, the coloring pale, the eyes set in a gaze not quite smiling, not quite sad. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment. She had seen those eyes before, not in paint but across a teacup. The shape of the face, the angle of the chin, it was unmistakable. Not Vera Calthorpe. No, the likeness belonged to someone quieter, less assertive and far closer to the vicarage walls. It was Mrs. Durrant. Not as she was now, but as she must have been long ago. The eyes, though older, had not changed. That slightly pensive stillness, so characteristic of the woman's expression, had already taken shape. The canvas, once proudly displayed at Bleakridge House, had found its way here. Hidden, perhaps forgotten, but now remembered. In the weeks since the solicitor's arrival, the narrative surrounding Mrs. Durrant had remained undisturbed. She was the vicar's well-mannered wife, once companion to Lady Eleanor Bleakridge, and nothing more. But that explanation now frayed beneath the weight of observation. The portrait had spoken with more honesty than words ever could. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the embroidered crest, the careful stitching that had erred in a way only memory could produce, to the dust-laden birth certificate in the attic box, to the withdrawn glances, the quiet panic behind civility. It had all pointed here. Mrs. Durrant was not merely a former servant. She had never truly been one. She had been raised as an outsider to her own inheritance, sheltered by discretion, and placed within reach of legitimacy, without ever crossing into it. And now, with Lady Eleanor gone, the remaining claim to the Bleakridge legacy, be it legal or moral, rested with her. Miss Marple understood that secrecy had for years been this woman's only inheritance. It had allowed her to marry quietly, to become part of the parish tapestry, to avoid the harsh light of social dissection. But inheritance has a way of rising, like sap in springtime, and someone, it seemed, had decided that it should never reach the root. Mr. Fry had not been a man given to unnecessary disclosures. Even in death his demeanor lingered, measured, discreet, and difficult to decipher. Yet now Miss Marple saw the rhythm beneath the surface. The visits he had made, discreet ones to the church archives, conversations with the vicar, even the questions posed at tea, had not been without structure. He had traced the family line not through names shouted from rooftops, but through whispers in margins, through creased documents, and untold histories. He had discovered the truth about Mrs. Durrant, and more than that, he had intended to act on it. Miss Marple considered the unopened telegram. Its arrival had coincided too precisely with his death. It had been addressed to him, but contained information for another, a name, perhaps, or an instruction to prepare a claim. He had been poised to make it official, and then, quite suddenly, he had died. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Poison, delicately administered in the calm of an afternoon garden. No overt violence, no struggle. Simply a man silenced at the moment he was to speak. Someone else had known, or suspected, what Mr. Fray had uncovered, and they had taken steps not to disprove it, but to ensure the truth never had the chance to live. There is a particular kind of fear that does not shout, but watches. It lives in the margins of conversation, in the timing of glances, in the unnatural stillness of someone who does not wish to be seen. Miss Marple knew it well. The truth about Mrs. Durrant was not just a matter of legacy. It was a matter of legitimacy. If revealed, it would cast doubt on the order so carefully maintained in the village. It would raise questions about marriage, about name, about bloodlines and claims. Someone, very likely someone already connected to the Durrants or to the Holloways, had everything to lose if such revelations reached the public record. It was not hatred that killed Mr. Fry. It was not even greed in its rawest form. It was fear of upheaval, of disgrace, of being removed from a place not rightfully held, of being made lesser in the eyes of others. That sort of fear acts quietly but with precision. It poisons not out of anger but out of desperation. Miss Marple recognized it for what it was, her defensive murder, not to gain something new, but to protect what had never truly belonged. In assessing guilt, one must ask not only what could have been done, but who had the capacity to do it. Mrs. Durrant, though central to the mystery, did not fit the requirements of the act. The walking stick found snapped near the hedge, its silver band bearing faint, almost imperceptible initials, was not hers. She did not walk with aid, nor did she possess the kind of force to break such a thing in two. And if she had hidden anything in the attic, she would never have sought it again in so bold a manner. The scent of heliotrope, floral and lingering, had clung to the garden the afternoon Mr. Frey died. It was not a scent Mrs. Durrant had ever worn. Miss Marple, attentive to such details, knew her to favor lavender water, if anything at all, and the laudanum, its disappearance quiet, yet sinister, did not align with her temperament. She was not bold, nor reckless. The methodical orchestration of the murder required planning and emotional detachment. Mrs. Durrant, whatever her secrets, bore the pain of them visibly, which meant the act had been committed by someone else, someone close enough to know the vicarage intimately, but distant enough to act without grief. It was a moment that might have escaped notice had Miss Marple not been attuned to the minutiae others overlooked. Lydia, the Holloway's niece, had returned that afternoon in a show of concern, offering to assist with flowers for the altar. She was poised as ever, her manner light, her expression unreadable. But it was when she removed her gloves, ivory kid, immaculately kept, that Miss Marple caught the scent. Faint, unmistakable, and wholly incongruous with village life. Heliotrope, not from the garden, not from the air, from the gloves themselves, worn by the same hand Tilly had once seen, adjusting the tea tray. A scent rarely chosen now, but once favored by women with particular sensibilities, delicate, controlled, and subtly theatrical. Miss Marple asked after the gloves, quite conversationally. Lydia smiled, said they had belonged to her mother. Yet the perfume was fresh. It was not proof, not in a court, but it was the last link in a chain that now wound tightly round the truth. The scent, the gloves, the knowledge of the house, the desperate motive. Lydia had seen the documents. She had known what the solicitor intended, and she had removed him not for revenge, but to keep her hands clean of Legacy's ruin. There is a kind of truth that lies in repetition. Miss Marple, armed not with authority but with precision, set about her task, not by accusation but by enquiry. She invited the vicarage guests of that fateful tea to recount the event once more. Not the grand events, but the smaller ones. Who sat where, who passed the milk, who requested sugar. From these accounts she began to see the shape of the thing. Mrs. Calthorpe had sat to the right of the tea trolley, Mr. Fry on the left, nearest the garden path. Lydia had hovered, politely unassigned, and had offered to assist when the tray needed to be brought through. It had seemed gracious, almost helpful. No one had objected. Mrs. Durrant had been delayed briefly in the kitchen. Miss Marple considered the flow of movement, the order of cups poured, the placement of teaspoons, the direction in which the cream and sugar had circulated. Each guest remembered something slightly different, but the common points were enough. It was not in the pouring that danger had crept in. It was in the pause, those unnoticed seconds when the tray had been unattended, when the servant's eye was turned and the lady in gloves had adjusted something no one thought to question, and in that moment, death had slipped its measure into the ordinary. The vicarage sugar spoon was part of a modest silver set, inherited and long used. Its handle bore the faintest crest, now nearly erased by time, and one edge was nicked with a barely visible chip, so small that only someone accustomed to handling it would have a notice. But to those who knew it, it was a quiet annoyance, one discussed often below stairs. Miss Marple, always attentive to detail, asked if anyone recalled which spoon had been placed in the sugar bowl that day. The responses were vague, except Tilly's. The maid, after brief hesitation, admitted that the chipped spoon had been missing, replaced by the decorative one from the parlor set. That discrepancy struck Miss Marple as no accident. She asked next who had last touched the sugar bowl before the guests arrived. Mrs. Durrant had not. Tilly had not. But Lydia, yes, Lydia had been in the room, had moved the bowl to center it. As she'd said with a smile no one had questioned. Miss Marple's suspicion deepened. The poison had not been placed in the tea itself. It had been administered via the sugar spoon. One guest's, one cup. And only Mr. Fry had taken sugar, and only from the bowl after Lydia's subtle rearrangement. It was with great difficulty, and no small amount of gentleness, that Miss Marple extracted the truth from Tilly. The girl was pale, her eyes ringed with fear. But the shame weighed more heavily than silence, and in Miss Marple's company, she allowed her guard to slip. Tilly had intercepted letters, not by intention at first, but by suggestion. Lydia had asked her, ever so casually, to check for any post addressed to Mr. Frey from London. She said she was helping with his work, ensuring nothing was lost. Tilly, flattered, had obeyed. But it had not stopped there. Lydia had asked her to remove one particular envelope, a telegram. She had promised to return it after confirming its contents. When Tilly hesitated, Lydia had threatened her, not with scandal but with dismissal. She claimed to have seen the girl take a pair of gloves that did not belong to her, a small theft that could cost her position. The gloves, borrowed and returned, became the noose. Miss Marple said nothing of judgment. She merely noted the pattern, a confident woman using pressure in quiet ways, always with a smile. And now, the telegram that had remained unread in Mr. Frey's pocket had a path, not of delivery, but of disappearance. Tilly's testimony had not only revealed the missing telegram, it also placed Lydia at the tray, unobserved and unopposed, during the critical moment. Miss Marple, always cautious with conclusions, now found the threads converging. The act had not required drama, only confidence. Lydia had approached the tray, adjusted the position of the sugar bowl, and with a flick of her gloved hand, switched the spoon, the chipped one removed, the poisoned one inserted, a small thing, a quiet thing. The sort of act only a woman accustomed to both domestic detail and social performance could manage without remark. The gloves, lace, ivory, and perfumed, had offered the perfect disguise. No fingerprints, no trace. But Tilly remembered them clearly. And now, so did Miss Marple. It was not just that Lydia had opportunity. It was that she alone had the mixture of motive and subtlety. Vera Calthorpe lacked the composure. Mrs. Durrant, the will. Tilly, the nerve. Only Lydia had both the means and the calculation. And she had known of Mrs. Durrant's past, either through gossip or perhaps through correspondence she had no right to read. To prevent the inheritance from passing to the rightful heir, she had made a calculated decision, and in doing so, ensured her own descent began not with scandal, but with a teacup. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the snapped cane discovered in the hedge near the garden. It had puzzled the villagers. No one recalled owning such a thing, and its sudden appearance had seemed oddly timed. Now she began to see its role. The cane, with its flattened end, bore marks not consistent with walking, but with force. It had not broken under weight, but under pressure. She surmised its use not as an aid but as a lever. It had been employed, she suspected, to pry open the attic box, the one containing the birth certificate and letters. That break-in, which had seemed an act of clumsy intrusion, now bore the hallmarks of targeted intent. Someone had needed access to the documents within, not to destroy them. They remained, but perhaps to copy or confirm or steal just one crucial piece. Lydia had the confidence and desperation required. Her position in the household, though nominally as guest, gave her quiet access. She knew which floorboards creaked. She had observed, not as a servant, but as a strategist. Miss Marple considered that the evidence of guilt is not always in the act itself, but in the pattern, the repeated return to danger, always cloaked as helpfulness. And Lydia, so graceful, had returned once too often. The final confirmation came not from documents or deductions, but from a scent. Heliotrope, old-fashioned, rare, sweet, with a strange undernote of decay. It was a perfume that had once graced vanity tables in London drawing rooms, but had since fallen from fashion. Miss Marple, however, remembered it well. It had clung faintly to the stranger who first visited the vicarage tea. It had hovered on the breeze the afternoon Mr. Fry died, and now, unmistakably, it accompanied Lydia. She had arrived that morning with an air of charming concern, offering to assist Mrs. Durrant with church flowers. When she removed her gloves, a different pair this time, but no less fine, the scent rose faintly, caught on the wrist where perfume lingers. Miss Marple noticed, as she always did, the heliotrope was not just fragrance, it was identity. The man in the gray suit had worn it, artificially, unnaturally, a borrowed scent, a disguise. But Lydia wore it like memory, and in doing so, betrayed her connection to the very beginning of the affair. She had impersonated a guest. She had stolen a telegram. She had altered the sugar spoon. She had entered the attic in the night. And now, in that delicate cloud of sweetness, she had marked herself, not with guilt, but with certainty. Miss Marple did not speak her conclusion aloud, but she began to prepare tea, for there was only one thing left to serve. The invitation was worded simply and spoken softly. There was no announcement, no formal summons, only Miss Marple's gentle request that a few of those present at the now infamous tea come to the vicar's garden once more. Just for clarity, she had said. The request, issued with her usual understated grace, carried a weight none could comfortably refuse. So they gathered, Mrs. Calthorpe, with her mauve hat and narrowed gaze, the Holloways, standing just a little apart from one another, Vera Calthorpe, drawn and pale, and Lydia, poised as ever, her gloves once again immaculate. Tilly hovered near the trellis, clearly summoned but uncertain of her place. Miss Marple stood quietly near the rose border, her hands folded over her handbag, her eyes resting not on any one individual, but occasionally flicking towards the tea tray now prepared. Untouched, symbolic. The atmosphere was neither accusatory nor convivial. It was rather the sort of hush that falls before truth is spoken. The village, for all its gossip and conjecture, knew the difference between rumor and reckoning, and they sensed that what was about to unfold belonged firmly to the latter. Miss Marple began not with a question, but with a gentle recollection of a gentleman in a gray suit, of a sugar spoon, of a name that never appeared on the guest list. And as her words unfolded, so too did the knots that had held the village in its quiet state of unease. Miss Marple did not rush her account. She moved with careful cadence, layering detail upon detail, allowing each listener to follow the path as if guided through a garden with hidden gates. Mr. Frey, she explained, had not come merely to inquire, but to confirm. His investigation had led him not to the self-proclaimed heir, Vera, but to Mrs. Durrant, whose identity had been quietly concealed beneath the role of companion and, later, vicar's wife. The portrait in the storeroom, the birth certificate in the attic box, and the errors in embroidery all pointed to the same truth, that she was the illegitimate daughter of Lady Eleanor Bleakridge. With that truth came inheritance, not simply of property, but of place. And it was this that Lydia had come to fear. Miss Marple's voice softened but did not falter as she described the method: the removal of the chipped spoon, the introduction of the poisoned one, the positioning of the sugar bowl, and the certainty that only Mr. Frey would use it. His death, she said quietly, was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but a decision made out of desperation to preserve a place at a table someone feared losing. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. And it was fear, as always, that made the hand act swiftly, where words would have unraveled the truth far more gently. It was never a question of brute force, Miss Marple continued, but of precision. The manipulation had not been of objects alone, but of people, their assumptions, their habits, their quiet, habitual trust. Lydia had inserted herself with seamless ease. She had offered to assist with tea, and the offer had been accepted as kindness. She had spoken to Tilly with the soft pressure of implied threat, not cruelty, and the girl, frightened, guilt-ridden, had done as asked. Even the use of heliotrope, so distinct and so carefully chosen, had served to unbalance those who sensed but could not name something wrong. It had lingered in the air, unsettling and misplaced. But the tea tray had been her stage. By appearing to help, she had claimed the right to touch, adjust, realign. And in doing so, she had switched the spoon. That it had gone unnoticed was not due to brilliance, but because of familiarity. No one suspects the one who smiles. No one questions the woman who offers to serve. Miss Marple's voice, still gentle, now bore steel. In such environments, she said, crime thrives not by violence, but by civility turned to subterfuge. And when trust becomes a tool, even sugar can be used to poison. There was no cry, no collapse, no melodrama. Lydia stood still, her fingers clasped before her, and for a moment said nothing. The silence was complete. The village held its breath, not in disbelief, but in waiting. When she did speak, her voice was low, almost conversational. She had known, she said, or at least suspected. She had found the letters some years before, quite by accident, while staying in the vicarage one summer. She had read enough to understand the truth of Mrs. Durrant's past and what it might mean. When Mr. Frey arrived, she saw at once the risk. She had intercepted the telegram, confirmed her fears, and acted, not out of hatred, never that, but because she believed with a conviction born of upbringing that she was meant to have something more. She could not bear the thought of being displaced, overlooked, made lesser. She had not intended to kill him, she claimed, only to delay, to confuse. But when the chance came, when the sugar spoon lay unguarded and the bottle of laudanum within reach, she had acted. Her voice trembled not with remorse, but with the weight of a truth long carried. And then she fell silent again. Tilly, who had stood still as a bird caught in a thunderclap, now crumpled with the soundless force of emotion, too long repressed. Her sobs were not for Mr. Frey, though she had respected him, nor for Lydia, whose smile at once seemed genuine. The tears came from shame, the part she had played, however unwittingly, in the destruction of a man's life. Mrs. Darrant did not speak. Her hands were folded, her posture upright, but her eyes shone with a sheen that came not from shock, but from long-delayed mourning. She had lived quietly, privately, never expecting recognition. Her mother's name had been a secret she accepted, not challenged. That others had taken steps to erase her a second time. That was the wound. Miss Marple placed a hand gently on her arm. No words were exchanged. It was not the time for comfort, only for truth. The others stood still, uncertain. Even Mrs. Calthorpe, for once, found no clever turn of phrase. For in that moment, the past had walked into the garden not with ceremony, but with the quiet dignity of those who have been forgotten long enough. And though justice stirred the air, grief still sat at the table. As the hum of conversation slowly gave way to the rustle of police arriving at the garden gate, Miss Marple turned from the gathering and wandered, not aimlessly, but with a gentle purpose, toward the far edge of the border. There, tucked beneath the dappled shade, stood a rhododendron, once vibrant, now wilting. Its leaves drooped, browned at the edges, its bloom already spent before the season's end. Miss Marple bent slightly and examined the base of the stem. There, barely visible, with a faint grains of powder, traces of something left behind, perhaps in a careless hand or with subtle intent. It was laudanum, she was almost certain. Enough to kill small things. Enough perhaps to test a dose. She straightened slowly and said aloud, though not loudly, "One must always know what one is planting." Behind her the constable was taking names, and Lydia had already been led gently aside. Miss Marple returned to the path, her expression composed. The garden would recover, the rhododendron could be replaced, but it would take time, for even the quietest poisons leave something behind, if not in soil, then in memory. And in Little Wexham, memory bloomed longer than most dared expect. By the second week of June, the garden at the vicarage had resumed its usual rhythm. The snapdragon stood tall once more, the teacups clinked gently on porcelain saucers, and Mrs. Darrant's voice, though quieter than before, returned to its natural timbre when discussing chrysanthemums. The police inquiry had concluded with the delicacy appropriate to its setting. Lydia had been removed not in shackles, but with a traveling case, and the kind of silence that suggests discretion rather than disgrace. Charges, though inevitable, had been described as pending, and no names appeared in the local press. The matter of the Bleakridge estate was settled without contest. Mrs. Darrant, to the quiet astonishment of many and the whispered vindication of a few, was granted both legal recognition and inherited right. Her modest dignity remained unshaken. She did not boast, nor withdraw. She simply resumed her life, with a slight air of melancholy, and perhaps a deeper appreciation of the garden her mother had once favored. Vera Calthorpe, who had not been unkind but had believed herself destined, took the outcome with a blend of resignation and sudden humility. She visited less frequently, but when she did, brought flowers from her own garden, tulips mostly, arranged with care and no commentary. It seemed, outwardly at least, that little Wexham had returned to its familiar embroidered calm. But Miss Marple, always attentive to tone as well as text, knew that silence, once broken, never quite resumes its original shape. The human capacity for returning to routine is considerable. By midsummer, the affair at the vicarage had become less subject of conversation and more a bookmark, referred to obliquely, cited with a sigh, and filed alongside other village curiosities such as the year of the cricket pitch scandal and the sudden elopement of the greengrocer's daughter. Yet Miss Marple knew that forgetting is never truly complete. Gossip, like smoke, may dissipate in open air but leaves its scent on the curtains. At the Thursday sewing circle, Mrs. Calthorpe now chose her words with greater delicacy. Mr. Holloway, having once defended Lydia's manners rather too enthusiastically, now confined himself to discussions of hedge maintenance. Tilly, though quieter, had gained a certain respect. Her part in the affair had softened her in the village eye, turning her from a servant into something more akin to a witness of consequence. The subject of Mrs. Darrant's inheritance was delicately avoided. She had not altered her conduct in any outward way, but those who had once seen her as merely the vicar's wife now looked twice. Respect, tinged with something like unease, had replaced habitual dismissal. And yet, under the polished surfaces and Sunday hats, a quiet shift had occurred. The village had glimpsed the truth that lies beneath appearances, that every life holds a hidden paragraph, and sometimes that paragraph contains a name no one wished to read aloud. Miss Marple, as always, read between the lines. The afternoon was warm, and the tea had been brewed precisely 4 minutes. Miss Marple believed timing was everything, particularly in both tea and murder. She sat across from her cousin Helen, who, though still fond of gossip, had developed a new restraint in its execution. They spoke of ordinary things, the health of the bishop's wife, the annual garden fete, the curious decision to move the bus stop nearer to the post office. And then, quite naturally, the conversation drifted. Miss Marple, turning her cup gently in its saucer, remarked that guilt is rarely loud. In her experience, the truly guilty seldom bluster or rage. They observe, they arrange, they apologize too quickly. They use politeness not as habit, but as camouflage. She had known something was wrong the moment Lydia adjusted the tea tray. It was not what she did, but how she did it, with confidence, with purpose, but lacking the unconscious ease of those truly at home. She spoke, too, of the perfume. Scent, she mused, reveals far more than words, particularly when one wears what doesn't suit them. Helen, listening, made no interruption. She, too, had seen the edges fray, and Miss Marple, stirring her tea exactly twice, added with quiet finality, "It is not the event that reveals the truth, but the gesture, the way one lifts a cup or folds a letter or remembers what they should not know." Then she smiled and poured another. The garden had grown quiet again, save for the hum of bees near the lavender. The teapot had cooled, but Miss Marple had always believed that the final cup, cooler, quieter, was the one most suited to reflection. "Murder," she said softly, more to herself than to Helen, "is often like overbrewed tea." Her cousin looked up, puzzled. "Overbrewed?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, it begins as something harmless, leaves and water, but left too long, it turns bitter, undrinkable, and most never notice until they've already taken the sip." She set her cup down gently. Lydia had not been a monster. She had not set out to kill in malice, She had merely, as so many do, left her envy too long steeping, allowed it to thicken, to settle, until it touched the lives around her with quiet venom. The tea, the garden, the gloves, it had all seemed so civil, and yet behind that civility had brewed something precise and cruel. Miss Marple had often said the most dangerous crimes are not those of impulse but of arrangement. They require patience, poise, an understanding of when to act, and when to appear, as if one has not acted at all. She looked once more at the roses, now in fuller bloom than before. Beneath beauty, she thought, lies soil, and in soil, rot, root, and mystery alike. Thank you for staying with us through this quiet, shadowed path of inheritance, guilt, and the bitter truth, hidden in something as innocent as a second cup of tea. As the village of Little Wexham slowly returns to its daily rhythm, we are reminded, through Miss Marple's ever-watchful eyes, that true evil rarely arrives with fanfare. More often it lingers softly behind lace curtains, dresses itself in politeness, and serves its intentions on porcelain. The story leaves us with a sobering thought. Guilt may be buried, but it leaves traces, in forgotten birth records, in the scent of a fading perfume, in a sugar spoon chipped just so. And justice, in Miss Marple's world, doesn't come with handcuffs or headlines. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.